Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the Getting to Zero Coalition. My name is Ingrid Sidenvall. I'm a project director of at the Global Maritime Forum. So the Getting to Zero Coalition is a partnership between the World Economic Forum and the Global Maritime Forum. We have more than 200 members now from across the maritime value chain, supported by knowledge partners, intergovernmental organizations, and endorsed by a number of governments. And the ambition of the Getting to Zero Coalition is to have zero-emission vessels operating on deep seas from 2030, so commercially viable zero-emission vessels. And this is towards reaching a full decarbonization by 2050. A priority for the coalition in order to reach that ambition is to support an ambitious outcome at the MEPC 80, so Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO, which should include an increased level of ambition and a progress around measures with an equitable transition as a priority. And it's in that context that we are organizing this webinar. So we are working with the coalition around policy action at the IMO. And for that important work, obviously we cannot do it ourselves, so we work with our industry members, but we also have crucial support from our knowledge partners. I'd like to highlight in that context UMass, so University Maritime Advisory Services that are supporting us for this. And I think my colleague will be sharing a recent analysis that was written by UMass. And we're also very fortunate to have the support by the Environmental Defense Fund and the High Level Climate Champions, among other members of the coalition. So before we get started, I should mention that this session is being recorded. There is also a possibility to use the chat box for questions. We will try to answer a few questions during the webinar, but we will also answer them directly in the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Blaxekjaer, who will be facilitating this session. So Lau is a senior project manager at the Global Maritime Forum, where he supports this work of the Getting to Zero Coalition on zero-emission shipping and public-private collaboration. So prior to joining the Global Maritime Forum, Lau worked as a researcher on climate policy, and he was also Denmark's lead greenhouse gas negotiator at the IMO. And Lau also holds a PhD in political science. So we are in good hands. With that, I would like to hand it over to you, Lau.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, and warm welcome to everyone to this session. It's really great to see also many familiar names on the participants list. So we've been looking very much forward to this. Yeah, I just want to begin by saying that MEPC concluded last week, as you know, and today we will then explore different outcomes and critical steps lying ahead of us. And although MEPC 78 was not intended to be a key decision-making milestone meeting, it was a first of several meetings over the next 1 year, where we have a unique window of opportunity to see key decisions being made. And a window of opportunity for governments and industry and other maritime stakeholders to come together and make sure that zero-emission shipping is in line with the Paris Agreement and that can become a reality. As our first speaker, I'm pleased to welcome Roel Hoenders, who is head of air pollution and energy efficiency in the Marine Environment Division at the IMO. Roel, as many of you know, has a strong background in climate and shipping, and has worked in places like the European Seaports Organization, European Maritime Safety Agency, and the EU Commission before joining the IMO in 2018. And as always, after an MEPC meeting, there are lots of commentaries and analyses, about the outcomes and what is needed looking ahead. And I'm sure you must be busy right now writing up the MEPC report and looking into all the details of what was said and what wasn't. But I'm sure that you're the right person to actually take us through and understand what MEPC 78 achieved and what we can expect of the next meetings in the autumn. And we would particularly be interested in hearing about how negotiations on the revision of the GHG strategy is going, as well as what we can expect of a basket of midterm measures and what that means for an equitable transition. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lau. Thank you very much, Ingrid, as well, and the Getting to Zero Coalition for organizing this event so shortly after MEPC. We're indeed still kind of tying up the report, trying to iron out some of the pending issues in the report, but we're sure that you will see the report appearing on IMO Docs soon, later this week or otherwise early next week. It was indeed, MEPC 78 was indeed a very good session in our view. We had, for the first time since 2019, quite a number of delegates back in the IMO building. We had over 100 delegates, so we had a bit of a flavor on how quick and how resuming physical meetings in the IMO building will look like. And overall, I think everybody was happy to see each other, have some chats in the IMO cafeteria, on the IMO terrace, in the corridors, and it overall helps, I think, the negotiation process. And so I'll give you a bit of an overview of what was negotiated, what was discussed last week. Greenhouse gas issues, particularly the revision of the strategy, was of course a very important part of the discussions last week, but the committee also touched upon other very important issues, including the designation of the Mediterranean Sea as an emission control area for sulfur oxide emissions. We made important progress on the marking of fishing gear and a number of other issues. So it was not just a GHG MEPC, but of course it took up quite a chunk of the time. So let me put up my screen and share it with you in order to run through it, and I hope you can see it now. So the session was chaired, let me, 1 second, I'll try that again. We did practice this before, but for some reason, the slide doesn't move to the next one now. Anyway, I hope you can see now the moving to the next one. Is that correct?
Yes, all right. It works now.
Sorry, Lau, too many screens open here. So the session was chaired by the vice chair of the committee, Mr. Harry Conway of Liberia, and some of you may have had some interaction with him also in the context of the comprehensive impact assessment that we carried out. And we had a steering committee established on that comprehensive impact assessment that was chaired by Harry. And so the committee was in good hands and made good progress on the various GHG issues. And of course, I'll come to the revision of the strategy, but just to highlight a couple of other things as well that were discussed and which are important in the overall context of implementing the current strategy and making progress towards 2030 targets. And just to start off maybe with some of the soft elements in the strategy, particularly the so-called national action plans to particularly help developing countries in all of our outreach programs to develop these kind of national action plans, to really look into what is the role of the shipping industry, what's the role of the port industry in a specific country. And we really like to use the reference to the national action plans to get and engage with some of the countries in order to increase their awareness about their potential, both in terms of collaboration across the value chain, in terms of renewable energy generation. So the national action plans is a key tool for us to do that, and also an element where we can involve other stakeholders in such activities. The GHG Trust Fund is a very important vehicle for us to support all of these kind of activities. The impact assessment that I just mentioned was largely funded by that. And we also launched a recent study that looks into maritime transport cost in Pacific, which is funded through the Trust Fund and which is an immediate follow-up of the comprehensive impact assessment. We had some additional pledges during MEPC, including from Denmark. So for those of you that are tuning in today, thanks again for supporting the work of the IMO in that regard as well. Coming then to the short-term measure, we had quite some important discussions earlier this year during the intersessional working groups in order to tie up the various bits and pieces related to the implementation of the short-term measures, or the short-term measure, which was adopted last year and which will enter into force in November of this year, putting in place the framework of the EEXI, the CII rating, the enhanced SAMP, and a number of other requirements. So following the very thorough work that was done by a correspondence group, which had over 300 participants, the intersessional work group 12 finalized a very broad set of guidelines supporting administration, supporting industry with the implementation of these EEXI, CII, and SAMP requirements. And MEPC 78, without too much discussion, actually endorsed these outcomes and the guidelines as prepared by the correspondence group and the intersessional working group. Now, there was a discussion, particularly in relation to so-called correction factors, voyage exemptions, with respect to the CII, the carbon intensity calculations, during both the intersessional working group and to some extent also during the committee. You're probably aware of some of the proposals related to port waiting time, adverse weather corrections that need to be, or that could be included in the framework as proposed by some of the member states, some of the industry partners. And so I think overall there is an understanding that the CII framework is still subject to quite some improvement. But at the same time, the committee agreed that it was very important to finalize these guidelines at this session in order to support the implementation as of the 1st of November. And then in relation to the review of the measure, which should be finalized by 2026, any further experience with the CII under real term conditions can, of course, be integrated. So with that, for now, we have finalized the bulk of the work on the short-term measure. And we can see quite an interest in the short-term measure now, also from other players along the value chain that are particularly interested in the rating and how the rating system can be used to involve their participation and transparency across the entire value chain. So the review is planned for 2026, and the committee agreed last week that any further proposals, any further experience with the implementation of CII can, of course, be submitted to future sessions of the committee. Now, coming then to the implementation and the revision of the strategy, I'd like to touch upon a couple of points. As you can see here on the slide, the life cycle assessment work. Safety regulations, of course, a very important part of the work of the IMO, the enhancement of the IMO data collection system, and of course, the development of midterm measures and the associated impact of states. And all of that would relate in some way or culminate in the revision of the strategy, which Lau, you mentioned, should be done and should be a revised strategy, should be adopted by MEPC 18. So on the life cycle GHG emission guidelines, again, the intersessional working group, the 11th session, which took place in March, made very important progress on the development of these life cycle assessment guidelines. I think it's clear for everyone that the development of the guidelines is a very essential element, particularly looking at the further midterm measures, particularly those measures that are based on carbon pricing, or the proposals for measures that are based or focus on a low carbon fuel standard. And in order to actually be able to progress the discussions on these midterm measures, everybody is of the understanding that this work on developing life cycle assessment guidelines is crucial. And the development of these guidelines will help direct investments, legal certainty in those fuels that have the lowest carbon content across their entire life cycle. And looking at the decision of the committee, which largely endorsed the outcome of the intersessional working group again, so really showing the importance and the value of the intersessional working groups, agreed that a correspondence group would be established last week, so by MEPC 78, which will focus and continue to work on the establishment of these life cycle assessment guidelines through a correspondence group. The correspondence group will be coordinated again by China, Japan, and EC, who have done, I have to say, a terrific job also in advancing the work on the short-term measure and the implementation, the guidelines of the short-term measure that I just mentioned. The correspondence group will send an interim report to MEPC 79, the session that will take place in December, and submit its final report to MEPC 80 in July next year. Discussions will focus particularly on sustainability criteria, third-party verification, certification, default values, also potentially taking into account regional differences between the feedstock and the fuel pathways. So a lot of work on the plate of the correspondence group, but looking at their past performance, we are confident that they will be able to progress this work in order to finalize the guidelines by MEPC 18. Now, on safety regulations, I don't want to expand on that because I can talk about that for a long time, but it is crucial, of course, that the work of both the MSC, so the Maritime Safety Committee, and the Marine Environment Protection Committee is aligned on these topics in order to really provide the global safety framework, allowing safe use on board, safe bunkering of all of the different fuels, the alternative low carbon fuels that we're discussing in MEPC today. And this is, of course, a vital element of the IMO, where we have a very strong track record. And so we also are confident that the Maritime Safety Committee, in support or supported by the various subcommittees, can advance the work on the establishment of such a safety framework. Touching then up the IMO data collection system. So there is, of course, already a requirement for ships over 5,000 GT to report their fuel consumption to the IMO data collection system through their flag states, and the Secretariat, we report on this fuel consumption. It plays a central role in the development of the further midterm measures, and particularly when we talk about carbon pricing, market-based measures, the strengthening and the central piece of the IMO data collection system is obvious. And so MEPC 78 agreed on a number of amendments to MARPOL Annex 6, particularly in relation to reporting requirements on the Eecke, the CII, and the rating values. So those amendments should be adopted by the next session and then enter into force early 2024. But MEPC also agreed on a new work stream that focuses on future revisions of the IMO data collection system. And this is, as I just mentioned, really focused on making the system more robust in order to allow for future reporting of carbon content, for instance, to support any carbon pricing or any other midterm measure. So important work also on that. Coming then to the midterm measures, and particularly, Lau, you mentioned it, the basket of midterm measures. Again, a lot of preparatory work, a lot of substantial work carried out by the intersessional working group, and we have to, or I have to thank, of course, the group for its hard work, the chair, Mr. Oftedal, for its hard work in preparing all of these different GHG work streams, which really facilitated the work of the committee during last week. And when it comes to the development of midterm measures, during its session earlier this year, we started work both on the so-called lessons learned exercise of the comprehensive impact assessment, and this will help the carrying out a future comprehensive impact assessment of the midterm measures, which will move forward. The lessons learned exercise of the comprehensive impact assessment, and we have our colleague from UNCTAD here as well, Jan, who's just sipping on his coffee in order to prepare for his intervention, will of course highlight the importance for many member states and for this organization, for the IMO as a whole, to really look into what are the impacts, the potential impacts on countries, particularly developing countries, when we design and work on putting in place new carbon pricing measures, GHG pricing measures, and make sure, and I'll come to that later, of course, that there is a truly just and equitable transition where we're not going to deepen the divide between developing and developed countries. So the development of a midterm package is very much linked to these comprehensive impact assessments. So these two work streams need to go in parallel, and this is what we have planned now. So various proposals on the table. I'm not going to dwell on those. You can see them on the slide. I guess you're all pretty much familiar with those. But following the discussions during the intersessional working group, MEPC last week endorsed that work of the intersessional working group, particularly in recognizing that all of these proposals, so be it a levy, be it emission cap and trade, be it a reward and fee-based system, contain valuable elements which need to be assessed in further detail among delegations by the group, and the intersessional working group, as endorsed by the committee, agreed on the further development of a basket of candidate midterm measures that integrates both technical and carbon pricing elements. And it's encouraging to see actually that the committee, without too much discussion, again endorsed all of these outputs, put in place a clear pathway for further discussions, and also send out a very strong signal to all of the proponents of the measures to work together. And we have a bit of a window now between MEPC last week and the next session for delegates to work together and see how some of the elements of these proposals, together with potential assessment of impacts on states, can be combined to pave the way for these measures to be established by the IMO. Coming then to the last bit, the revision of the strategy. We had an initial discussion on the revision of the strategy at MEPC 77, so December or November last year, which took place just after COP26. At that session, the IMO or MEPC already agreed to initiate the revision of the strategy and to strengthen the level of ambition and to invite for concrete submissions in that regard. We received those submissions, 13 to be precise. The committee started its consideration of those submissions, and I think we had a very good discussion last week. Of course, there is a divide between member states, looking at where they are geographically, where they are economically, but overall, the committee reiterated its commitment to this process, reiterated that the revision of the strategy should be finalized by MEPC 80, and also agreed, and I'll come back to that, on the kind of the logistical arrangements in order to make that happen. A lot of discussion focused on the level of ambition for 2050 as well as intermediate targets, and on how to ensure this fair and just transition. And there was one prominent delegate that spoke about a package in this regard, which was echoed by many other delegations. And I think that this is something that, of course, we will see coming back in advancing our discussions on the revision of the strategy, how these revised levels of ambitions, how the strengthened levels of ambitions can be combined with a fair and just transition. That said, I think it was encouraging to see that there was substantial support for phasing out emissions, GHG emissions by 2050, or achieving zero emissions net carbon emissions by 2050. Various terminology was used, and that requires further clarification. But that was encouraging to see that there was quite broad support for that approach among many delegations. Of course, a substantial number of other delegations were not in a position yet to commit to those levels of ambitions for 2050 or before. So we need to collectively continue work on that. As I mentioned, the just and equitable transition was mentioned almost by every delegation that spoke, and there were many delegations that spoke. Over 70 countries took the floor. Just an equitable transition, what can that comprise of? Financial technical support, access to technology, access to R&D, support to port infrastructure, etc., etc. So these are key elements that need to be further touched upon as we move forward. A number of other elements of the discussion during last week, sectoral targets versus across the board objectives. So how should targets be revised? Should there be a percentage of the fleet? I think, Ingrid, you mentioned in your introduction what the objective is of the Getting to Zero coalition in terms of targets for 2030. Is this something that should find its way to the strategy to be discussed? In sector or out sector financial support, particularly when we move ahead with the midterm measures and carbon pricing, should out sector financial support be foreseen and envisaged by the IMO? Linked to all of the discussions of the UNFCCC, extremely important for many delegations, and that does not only relate to the Paris temperature goals, but also to principles such as common but differentiated responsibilities. The need for additional studies to accompany the revision of the strategy, knowing that this needs to be done before MEPC 80, a comprehensive versus a very limited review of the strategy, all kinds of elements that still need to be ironed out as we move ahead. Now, MEPC 78 agreed to further work on all of these elements, but also to invite for concrete submissions to the next session, including concrete text proposals. So I think we have had a lot of discussion, but still work needs to be done on where do we start and on what basis. I mentioned it, additional studies to be carried out, and the Secretariat was invited to consider how this could be done, including also organizing information sessions or symposia on certain topics, think about the just transition, and of course, to work together intersessionally on developing these proposals. And I come to my last slide, and that is how we're moving forward. A clear agreement from the committee last week. Intersessional Working Group 13 should be organized back-to-back, meaning in person ahead of the next session of MEPC. So that will be early December. The committee agreed that the main focus of the Intersessional Working Group should be on the revision of the strategy, finalizing the review of the procedure for assessing impacts on states, and the further consideration of the basket of measures. MEPC 79, including a GHG working group, will continue these discussions. And then committee, MEPC already agreed on 2 intersessional working groups to take place in the spring of next year. Intersessional Working Group 15 is likely to be organized back-to-back with MEPC 80. And the provisional dates of those sessions you can see on the slide. So end of June, early July, and that MEPC 80 should then agree on the revision of or on the revised strategy, and will also mark the end of phase 2 of the consideration of midterm measures. Will probably give us a clear direction on the way forward, as well as how to progress on a comprehensive impact assessment of that basket of measures. So with that, thank you very much. Yeah. And I look forward to the further discussion here.
Thank you very much, Roel, for such an informative presentation and synthesis of MEPC 78. And the work ahead of us, quite a lot of work ahead of us, I see, but hopefully we can everyone really work together on this. Now I would like to introduce our second speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Michel Ardohain, who is head of Environmental Transition of Shipping Unit, the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries in the Ministry for the Sea, the Government of France. And Michel, France has a long history of constructively engaging with other maritime stakeholders and working together with others in the IMO to develop and improve regulation. France also currently holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and France has also signed up to the Declaration for Zero-Emission Shipping along with 30 other governments. So you are in the right place to speak about high ambition and give us good news of where we are with MEPC 78 and looking ahead. So did we see a continuation from MEPC 77 on high ambition especially when it comes to revision of strategy, a price on carbon, and an equitable transition? Michel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lau, and good day to all. This is a big question. Just before developing on GHG matters, I just wanted to say one word about the decision by MEPC 78 to designate the Mediterranean Sea as a sulfur oxide emission control area from 2027. It is maybe one of the most concrete results of this meeting, and as a very proactive state on this file, we are proud of it, and we are now looking towards a Mediterranean NOx emission control area, hopefully, which will be challenging too. But I just wanted to stress that because I think it's a very important and concrete result. Now on GHG, coming back on all this issue, Roel has said, I think, most everything. So I just maybe try to share our feeling and perspective as France and also as a European state on this result. First, on the midterm measure, maybe we consider that the agreement that we had on the necessity to have a combination of technical and also GHG pricing elements in future measures is a quite good step. Of course, it always seems slow and laborious at IMO, but we should not forget that a failure is still possible at IMO. It already happened some years ago. And in the current very difficult geopolitical and economical context, to be able to continue to work and to progress together is a quite good result. We need to progress step by step, cleverly, and with this result, for the moment, we are on track and on time with our work plan. So this is quite positive for us. Now, on the revision of a strategy, this maybe was the most difficult point of the meeting. Not surprisingly, we had the traditional divide between developing and developed states regarding the question of respective responsibilities in climate change, impacts on states, etc. We are always suspected as Europeans to try to put away these issues, which is not true, because we know that we will have to take the question of equitable transition, as Roel said, very seriously. We know that we will have to show some solidarity in the future measures with some developing countries if we want to succeed together, and we are ready to do that. We would prefer to do that in the design of future concrete measures, for example, through the redistribution of potential revenues for GHG pricing measure, for example. We would prefer doing that in measure rather than in the strategy, which the high level principles have a quite good balance for us at the moment. But on the other side, we will continue, of course, to push hard for a better alignment of the levels of ambition of a strategy with and possible also additional intermediate targets ahead of 2050 with a decarbonization trajectory of the sector, which would be compatible with the Paris Agreement. This is very important for us, of course. It would be a hard negotiation, And in this regard, we welcome very much the offer by the IMO Secretariat, and thank you, Roel, during the meeting to work rapidly on additional studies or information sessions to progress on the matter. I think this can be very useful because we need to provide some rationality into the debate, also maybe to reassure on the feasibility of the transition. And maybe the Getting to Zero coalition could also play an interesting role in this process. Now, regarding the next steps, and I would be very brief, as you know, Europe is a key player at IMO, and we want to continue to be one. We want to be ambitious, but we also know that we will have to be pragmatic. We know that decisions at IMO are in the end the results of compromise. So we want to be an ambitious and reasonable partner. And to keep this leading role, we will need to work now very rapidly, probably this summer, to provide more detailed and concrete proposals in submissions. And we will have to progress on very complex questions, which remain open at this stage. In particular, how do we combine a technical measure, and most probably for us, it would be a GHG fuel standard. That is one of the best thing to do and most optimal thing to do now. How to combine it with an incentivizing measure. Should we develop a market-based measure as a standalone measure, or as part, for example, of flexibility mechanism of a GHG fuel standard, for example? If we had to develop a standalone NBM, should we go for a levy-based approach or a cap-and-trade approach? We still have to progress on this question and make up our mind, even at the European level. Which flexibility mechanisms for such measure? We know that we will need some, potentially building upon interesting features from other proposals that were made at this session also. Another question would be how to deal with a well-to-wake approach, for example, in a GHG pricing measure. This would be very complex, and maybe also here again, the Getting to Zero coalition could help us find possible solution on these specific issues. We need maybe to be a bit creative and innovative on that. And of course, and I will conclude here, how to ensure an equitable transition, how potential funds will be used. There are many ideas. It would be a very political negotiation, but we also have to be efficient to help decarbonize the sector and to ensure that no one is left behind. So, of course, we'll not find answers alone to this question. We need to collaborate with other IMO member states, which are very constructive. There are many, if possible, in advance of the submissions, or otherwise in the meetings. It will be very challenging in the limited time we have, but we are looking toward this further collaboration. And I have to stop here. I'm sorry, it's very short, but happy to answer any question.
Oh, thank you very much, Michel, and also thank you for the invitation to work together. I think especially Getting to Zero coalition as a full value chain organization or coalition. I think we have a different perspective on some of these issues to help you be creative. Now I'd like to move to ship owner perspective. Maxime van Eecke, who is Chief Commercial Officer of the CMB Group. As you may recall, CMB's CEO signed a recent op-ed published in TradeWinds ahead of MEPC 78, where ship owners revealed their zero-emission wish list for the IMO and for member states. CMB is also one of 240 signatories to the call to action for shipping decarbonization. Maxime, from what you've just heard, what are the main takeaways at this point in time, and do you see the necessary signs of progress and clear signals for industry to decarbonize? And I'd also just like to encourage you to be brief in your intervention. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Well, thank you, Law, for allowing me to sort of to share our views as an industry player. Obviously, as a shipping company, we approach all this from an industrial point of view. And if I can be short and perhaps a little bit blunt, the conclusion or the impression we have is It's too little and too late. It's very good to start talking about sort of a net zero in 2050. It's very good to start talking about, oh, we should take intermediate measures in 2030 and in 2040. But from all these discussions, there's very, very few concrete measures being proposed or taken. If I take Michel's comment, I think the elaboration of the Eecke zone in the Med is a concrete measure, is a good measure, but it's only a drop in the sea. And unfortunately, it's not enough. And again, I'm talking as an industrial player. We have, or we are in a historical situation where you have a full industry that is very much committed to reduce the carbon emissions, and that we can at least achieve by latest 2050 a zero carbon industry. But unfortunately, in order to do that, we need to start responsibilizing governments and regulatory bodies like the IMO to provide us with the tools to actually achieve this. These tools, and whether on any regulatory level, whether it's regional, national, supranational, these tools will determine actually the pace of the decarbonization. It's not the willingness of the industry that is not there. No, the willingness is there, but please provide us with the tools. And in a lot of situations, I think the best way forward is the tactic of the carrot and the stick. On the one hand, we decide to sort of take certain measures, GHG pricing measures. I think that's a very good idea, and I think we need to be a little bit bold into this and be ready to take big steps in that respect. We, for example, are very much supporter of a carbon levy, and use that money then again to ensure that you have that equitable transition worldwide, because it's only then that we will have everyone on board on this topic. And in parallel with sort of the stick, as I like to call it, it's the carrot. Gave us a framework where we as industry players, we can do the necessary investments in order to reduce our carbon emissions. And unless and until you have this, there's very few things you can do. We're focusing very much today on shipping companies, charterers, ports, and we say, they need to cooperate. Yes, true, but there's so many more players in the value chain that needs to be involved. For us as a shipping company, we want to develop the future ships, the zero carbon ships. But as long as the molecule is not available, as long as the engines are not available, there's very few things we can do. Everyone needs to contribute his part in the full value chain. And you can only do that when all the regulatory bodies ensure that you can do this in a structured way. So in a nutshell, are we making progress? Yes, we definitely are. I think we do see that equitable transition is an important element to succeed the objectives we've set for ourselves. I think we're realizing as well that a focus on 2050 is not enough. 2030, 2040 is the groundwork to achieve what you want to achieve in 2050. So just to conclude, I think, yes, there is progress, but we need to be bolder and we need to push it through, because time remains of the essence.
Thank you, Maxime, also for those sobering words. So there is building momentum for zero-emission shipping by 2050, but is that enough? No, we need to really set also the very short-term concrete steps to do that and to ensure an equitable transition. Thank you for those points. Now I'd like to turn to Masao Yamasaki, our next speaker. And Masao, is the manager at the Zero-Emission Transition Center at ClassNK, also a signatory to the call to action. Masao has been with ClassNK since 2000 and also worked in IMO's Marine Environment Division from 2014 to 18. Masao-san, if I can ask you, class societies work closely with implementation of regulation. So in your view, to decarbonize shipping, are we and the IMO on the right track? Is industry and on the right track here? So please, if you could elaborate a little, and I would also like you to be brief. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Rao-san, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all participants of the webinar. In my view, very shortly, I believe that IMO and maritime industry are on the right track for the shipping decarbonization. For IMO, it adopted the initial strategy in 2018 and agreed to revise the strategy in 2023, next year. In my understanding, it is a consensus that revised strategy should be strengthened in terms of the levels of emission. In addition, a number of member states support that the revised strategy should explicitly state vision and the levels of ambition over the time frame consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. IMO is expected to show the clarity on regulation from levels of emission, namely clear 2030, 2040, 2050 targets in line with Paris Agreement temperature goal, and to establish measures to deliver these targets to be adopted in a timely manner. For industry, it is noteworthy that so-called fast movers are paving the way for shipping decarbonization. The concept of green corridor is a good example, and I noted that a lot of green corridors are considered all over the world now. In this connection, the case study published by the Getting to Zero Coalition last year was one that caters for the need of maritime value chain. Coming back to the clarity on regulation, we cannot do this alone. The market cannot solve this without relevant regulations, especially a price of carbon. In my view, we need to focus on scalable zero-emission fuel and vessels, and it takes time from regulation is adopted to see vessels and fuels in place. IMO will focus on, in addition to the revision of strategy, the consideration of market measures, market-based measures in coming years. Relevant from the revenues from the MPM could spur further investment in the energy transition. But last but not least, as you said, that the classification society have been working closely with implementation of regulations. But recent years, supporting area of the classification societies becomes very wider. The role of the classification society should focus on not only the implementation of regulations, but also support fast movers in their effort for the decarbonization. That's all for I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Masao-san, for your comments, and also to really focus on a lot of the actions that are taking place with, for example, national action and first movers, different coalitions we see emerge, and green corridors. So I'd just like to now welcome our last speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Jan Hoffmann, who is head of Trade Logistics Branch in the Division on Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD. Jan is co-author and co-editor of multiple publications, such as the annual UNCTAD Review of Maritime Transport, and has been with UNCTAD since 2003. A lot has already been said, and many people know you. But I would just like to mention that I'm really looking forward to digging deeper into one of your latest UNCTAD research papers on developing a global transport cost dataset for international trade. May sound boring, but this is actually very important for what we've heard previously about how to ensure an equitable transition. Because we need these data sets available to really understand how it impacts everyone. So Jan, in your view, how do you see shipping decarbonization also as part of a bigger picture of global climate governance and the necessary energy transition that we are also facing? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lau. Thank you, colleagues. A very timely event between MEPC and then the UN Oceans Conference in Portugal, for which we are also preparing in that same broader context. Yeah, three thoughts I wanted to share in this overall context. And overall, I think we are very much shooting in the same direction with what also Michel and Maxime and Masao shared. First, the title also of this webinar, the opportunities. Unfortunately, it's human nature that we are much more concerned about losing, loss aversion, rather than winning. Like gaining potentially $10 is much less motivating than the fear of losing $10. Now, the opportunities from providing new fuels for also developing countries because of their geographic position, because their potential of solar, wind, hydro, that is something which we like to highlight also from UNCTAD's perspective. We had an event at Glasgow there with the IMO, with the World Bank support. I think that is something I just want to highlight here, how we all together in this, the GMF, all the partners here, can somehow move the mindset more towards the opportunities. Second, I think all of us have mentioned the market-based measures. In fact, as an economist, I would say a levy is not really a market-based measure. It's a levy, it's a fixed thing, but it is still a very good thing because it's an economic incentive, and I think that's why it's called like this. And colleagues here know that 27 years ago, when I worked for the IMO Secretariat, I was already preaching this idea of the polluter pays, internalization of externalities. I think it is very important because that's the one way that makes alternatives competitive, and especially GMF, which is private sector. That's, I think, the main advantage of this type of measure is it is not prescriptive. We do not yet know what will be the right technologies, fuels, solutions of the future. And well, let's set the price right, internalize externalities, and then the operators, the investors, the shipbuilders, they are the ones who then have to find the right tools. And this market-based levy leads me then to my third point, very close to our UNCTAD's heart, and several of you have mentioned it. The funds generated by such a levy can then be invested. I'm pleased to see the national action plans. Roel mentioned the study on the Pacific, where we also collaborate on the transport cost that you, Lau, just mentioned, the data set we are working on, where IMO is actually also a partner in a Sustainable Mobility for All initiative. So all this leads us at UNCTAD to continue to be ready to collaborate with the IMO, with the members on the impact assessments. And let me conclude with this. The way I see this, the linkage between the levy and the investment that needs to be done and the decarbonization, different countries will be affected differently. Different trades, different routes, different commodities, different countries. In our impact assessment, we have shown, you can quantify what is the impact on maritime logistics costs. They go up. Then order of magnitude, 1 point less, trade goes down. Another order of magnitude less, GDP goes down. You can quantify which countries are affected. So we see our contribution over the next decades as UNCTAD to make those assessments and then help proportionally, it's not theoretical, it works, to see, okay, those who are more negatively affected, they get support to somehow and through other means, through infrastructure, port management, FAL, single windows, maritime single windows, support to competition authorities, support to climate resilient ports. All these things, we can quantify how this helps reduce shipping costs, improve maritime connectivity, so that in the end, they are as well off as before. So I think that's the way how I see also UNCTAD's contribution to this joint endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Good to hear all the collaboration that's already ongoing, but also and understand. I think what we've seen over the last year, perhaps, is that, also speaking to what Maxime said, is that we know a lot more. We have maybe increased our understanding of some of the questions. You know, what technologies are available, what fuels can be made. And we're moving to the questions of what policies do we need to support and enable the technologies, the fuels, the new port infrastructure. How do we also support different developing countries? As I say, much can be quantified. A lot other we know a lot that we can do this, but we need further policies to support this. And I think that's where we see the last two MEPCs move ahead on convergence on ambition, and now defining the next tough questions to be answered. So going forward in the autumn, you know, and towards MEPC 80 next summer, which is really the key MEPC here, we need to further develop a joint understanding of what an equitable transition means in policy terms and in practice. And we need to understand how to achieve this. And then we need to see how that all combines together with revising the strategy, developing the basket of midterm measures, with existing measures in place, and what other support from national and regional regulation that can also help in the bigger picture of this. So with these final words, I just want to thank all of you for following this webinar. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Roel for your presentation. Unfortunately, we were not able to respond to everything, but please write to us with your questions. We would love to follow up with everyone if you have anything else. Thank you all again for joining, and I hope to see you again in a future webinar, or indeed in London in the autumn for specific symposia, or at the next intersessional and MEPC. Thank you all.